today we're on lecture number 19. Okay, today we're on lecture number 19. We're going to be going over Ionic. Okay, this is one of the most useful tools that I think you can use in web development today. Now, doesn't mean you have to use Ionic, React, Vue, Ionic. These are all really popular. If you choose one of the three, you'll probably be good. I'm using Ionic because Ionic was originally teamed up with Angular. Okay, we talked about this kind of at the end of the last class. Ionic goes very well with Angular. So we're going to be using Ionic. If you go to the ionicframework.com and you go into the docs, it tells you how to install. Now you'll notice they have a drop down here. It works with React, it works with Angular, it works with Vue. Now what's really cool about this is originally Ionic and Angular were tied together. That's it. But then React started becoming popular as well. So Angular was really popular. Like I told you when we started it, they were just using JavaScript, and then they went to TypeScript when Google took it over. And Google, like I told you, it's more Java based, so they like TypeScript, so you can define types because it's really similar to Java. And a lot of other web developers, they don't like that. They like the JavaScript way to write code. So React kind of went back to what was called Angular.js. If you look at some of the links I posted on Canvas, you probably saw Angular.js. That's the first version. And to me, React is really similar to Angular.js, although they have differences. Now Vue is also becoming very popular. So you'll see Vue is also allowed here in Ionic. So what's nice about this is let's say you have a project, which we've done already. It's built in Angular. And then you have a client who says, no, I want to use React. Well, you could still use Ionic and just switch to the React version, which makes it really nice. So I really like Ionic. They're really stepping up their game. Not only can they work with the Angular, but also React and Vue. So if I want to get this thing going, I need to make sure that I install it correctly. Now, the first thing is if you've ever used Ionic before, or you're not sure if you used Ionic, you want to make sure you uninstall the old version. We're going to be on Ionic 5, and the CLI is on Ionic 6. So before you even run this command, let's go ahead and run this command right here, just to make sure. So go over to your terminal, or you can open up VS Code and run it in the terminal down below. I'm going to do it here so it's a little bit easier to read because the VS Code terminal text is small. But you can run this in the terminal. You'll do a sudo npm uninstall -g for globally Ionic. This is the old one. So before we even start the lecture, let's do this. And I'll tell you why. I was looking at code last night for the lecture, and I couldn't get the Ionic app to work. And I was fighting, struggling. I didn't know what was going on. In the end, it turns out I had an old version of Ionic, and it was conflicting with the new version of Ionic. So make sure you uninstall this. Okay, this is the old version. This is Ionic 4, and I think it's Ionic CLI 5. Okay, so make sure you do that first, and then come over here and do this one. Okay, so we're going to install globally at Ionic CLI. So we're going to run this after you do the uninstall. Now you're going to have to set this up because the next challenge requires Ionic. So this is an important lecture to follow. Not only am I going to make an Ionic app, if we have enough time, I'm going to show you how to make it on a mobile device. That's the whole point of Ionic. If you watched the previous lecture, I kind of talked for about 10 more minutes after the class time about Ionic and what it's used for. Remember, Ionic is the wrapper. So if I want to run an iOS or Android app, it's got to be an iOS or Android app. It's going to be Swift code. It's going to be Android code. So if I come over here and I look up Ionic cards, which I've showed you several times now, but you'll see here, just imagine this is a real phone. Let's say this is a real iOS phone. So this phone requires Swift to run. And in Swift, they have what's called a web view. So you can imagine the phone here, this black edge here is Swift. This white screen is what's called a web view. So I encapsulate a web view into the Swift iOS app, And then I can write website code, which is Angular, TypeScript, Ionic, React, Vue, whatever you want to write, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So I can encapsulate HTML, CSS, and JavaScript into an iOS app inside the web view. We did this in 3330. Do you guys remember the New York Times viewer, the one that we did in the lecture, New York Times viewer? That was a web view. We were writing and encapsulating web code into Java code. And that's essentially what's happening here. And then in Android, you can imagine this black square here. That's Android. That's like Java code or Kotlin. Okay, so they have Android. This is my Android code. The white screen here is another web view. But you'll see the two web views are different. This is going to be a Safari web view, and this is going to be a Chrome web view. So you'll see the cards are square in Chrome, and they're more rounded in Safari. Okay, if you get an error installing Ionic, make sure you're running sudo. Okay, sudo npm install globally, Ionic CLI. And then what you can do is you could do an Ionic info. If you do Ionic info, you'll see Ionic CLI is on 6.12. Cordova is not installed. You'll see Node.js, npm. Okay, all the information here. But Ionic CLI is 6. If I do an Ionic -- version, you should be able to see the same. Ionic -- version, does that not work? Okay, there it goes, 6.12.0. I usually like Ionic info. I don't know why it's not saying it, but it usually tells you the Ionic version. Not only does it tell you the Ionic CLI, but it should tell you the Ionic version. The Ionic version we're on right now is 5.4. Okay, that's the Ionic version that we're on. Now, once Ionic is installed, okay, so I'm just running through this here. You'll see I installed globally the CLI, and then it says you can do a start app. Now, at the end of the last class, I did the one where it has everything that Ionic has to offer. I recommend that you go through that. So if I come back to the command line, and you want to do this in the directory that you want to install the project in. So I'm going to cd into my 4830 directory. And I'm going to cd into lectures. And then you'll see I made a directory called Ionic. So mkdir lecture 19. We're on Ionic. You can do that. I'm going to cd into lecture 19. And then in here, I have a little bit of code, but I'm going to do an Ionic start. So the Ionic CLI is a little bit different. Remember in Angular, we did an ng new. If I search over here, this is the Ionic CLI, everything that you can do. I don't have a new. Okay, I don't have a new here, but I do have a start. So if I click on start, it says create a new project. So the Ionic CLI is just a little bit different, but you got to get used to it. If you're using Ionic, you got to use the Ionic CLI. And you'll see here, you can also do Ionic Help. Okay, Ionic Help. You'll see we're on 6.12. You'll see some students did init for the current challenge, MVC. They did init, but this is in beta. Okay, this is in beta. So if you had a Angular app and you just wanted to use the Ionic CSS, you could do that with init. But if you want to make a mobile app, you got to use start, which is what the next challenge requires you to do. You got to make a mobile app. So I'm going to do Ionic start. And look at this. I could use Angular, React, and Vue. How nice is that? Okay, you see Angular's first. I'm a little upset. If I go to their docs, they put React first. They're totally selling out on Angular, but that's all right. React is really popular, and Vue is coming up as well. But Angular used to be the first. Now they put it as the second. I can't believe they did this. But that's all right. You'll see Angular still first when you start up a project. That was their first connection. You know, they always had Ionic was for Angular, and then React, you would use React Native. But now you can use Ionic and React, which is awesome. And you can also use Vue, which is also becoming very popular. So and these may be good explorations. Maybe for an exploration, you look at React. Maybe for an exploration, you look at Vue. These are really popular frameworks as well. I would say if you know any one of these, any one of the three, then it's easy to learn the other. Okay, it's easy to learn the other. So I'm going to use Angular here. The project name is going to be called Ionic To Do. We're going to take our To Do app and make it an Ionic app. Okay, so we're going to do an Ionic To Do is the name. And here, earlier, I made a conference app. You'll see it's a kitchen sink application that shows off all Ionic has to offer. We're not going to do this today. I did this last class, but I recommend you create one of these and put it somewhere in your 4830 directory. That way you can look at the code and reference it. If you wonder what Ionic can do, if you want to know their different components and how they look on Android or iOS, this conference app is nice. Also, my first app is also a nice example, but definitely the conference has more. But today, we're going to make our own app. So we're going to make a blank starter project. Okay, so select blank starter project. Okay, you'll see it's going to take some time. Here it's going to ask if you want to use Capacitor. I recommend it. You should understand some history about Ionic. First, it started out as a project called Cordova. Okay, so it started out as Cordova. You'll see it's from Apache Cordova. This is still being used. Ionic is built on top of it. And then Ionic came out with Cordova. Okay, Ionic came out with Cordova. And now they have what's called Capacitor. And Capacitor is more up to date than Cordova. So I actually recommend you read some of these articles, Capacitor versus Cordova. That may be something that I require on an exploration or a challenge for you to compare. So if you already read it, you already have the knowledge. You'll see Cordova was called Phone Gap. Phone Gap used to be pretty slow, although it was okay. When Cordova came out, they made it a little bit easier. They had updates, but when Capacitor came out, it's pretty much the same as a native app. They have plugins so you can access GPS, camera, all the hardware, and it's really similar to a native app. So I'm going to say yes on Capacitor here, and make sure you go over some history on Ionic. You'll either see that somewhere on a quiz or maybe on a challenge for you to compare. It's going to take a while to install because you got to remember, first, Ionic is built on top of Angular. So first it has to set up an Angular app plus Ionic plus Capacitor. So this project is not going to be small. I have a native iOS and Android app that has a web view. Inside that web view, I have Angular as well as Ionic, and Capacitor is what wraps that web view into a native application. So this project is not going to be small. It's going to take some time. Even a blank project. Remember, this is a blank project. If I was installing the project that has everything it has to offer, I understand why it's taking this long. This is a blank project. There's nothing in it, and it still takes a while to implement. So we're going to write 10, 15, maybe 50 lines of code tops, but underneath the hood, there's a lot going on to make this application happen. Now, in some cases, that's good because then you only have to write 20 to 50 lines of code. In some cases, that could be bad because if something breaks, it's really hard to debug what's happening underneath the hood because you didn't write that code yourself. So there's always pros and cons to pretty much everything in programming, computer science, IT. So once this is done, if I do an ls, you'll see Ionic to do, cd into it, do an ls. You're going to notice it is a regular Angular application with Ionic. So once I have this, I can actually open it up in VS Code. So now I click on open. For some reason, my open's not been working. I don't know about you guys. I can't get my open to work for some reason. But I can do open more. Let's see. Nah, I don't want to open this. All right, let's see if I can type this in. Anybody having problems with their open? That's all right. I'll get it going up here in a second. 4830. Lecture 19. Ionic to do. Oh, come on. Did you say yes to creating a free Ionic account? I don't believe I have an Ionic account. Does it ask you to do that? To create a free Ionic account? I don't remember what I did for that. I would say no for now. And then you can do that later. Maybe in the Ionic page. I can't remember if I did that or not, to be honest. But I would say no for now. We can do that later. Let's see. Let me try opening up a workspace. VS Code, don't let me down. It already let me down on the server. I don't know if anybody figured out what was going on and connected VS Code to the server. Give me a second. Okay, let's see if this opens up. Okay, there we go. I don't know what was going on. I closed out VS Code, opened it back up, and here we go. So I'm in Ionic to do. You can open up the terminal here in VS Code. Once you're in it, so once you CD into it, do a PWD or do an LS, you can actually immediately do an Ionic serve. Remember we used to do ng serve, now we're doing Ionic serve. You'll see it's on port 8100. Okay, port 8100. Look at this. When I do an Ionic serve, it's really doing an ng run app serve on the host, local host at port 8100. So when I do an Ionic serve, all it's doing is Angular run. Angular run. It's doing an Angular serve for me, except it's doing an Angular run app. So remember, Ionic's on top of Angular. It's also on top of Cordova, but we actually installed Capacitor. So now it's also on top of Capacitor. But you'll see, if you've ever created an Ionic app, you're going to be using Cordova and Capacitor. If Capacitor doesn't have a plugin, you got to use Cordova plugin. So although we said yes to Capacitor, a lot of times Cordova is still used. Okay, when I do ng serve, here's a blank gap. They're doing black now. This did not used to be this way. The default was light mode. Now the default is dark mode. Okay, Henry says mine is light. Maybe what this is because my Mac is defaulted to dark mode. I don't know if that would change my whole website. Let me see. Anybody remember how to change Mac back to light mode? Let's see, general. Okay, let me go back to light mode. Okay, so maybe it's just my browser then. Maybe that's just my sense. I kind of like it dark, to be honest. I think that looks pretty awesome. But some people don't like black with the white text. I kind of like it, so I'm going to leave mine dark. If yours is light, that's okay. Okay, so it's running. Okay, it's running. And now I'm going to leave it running here in terminal number 1. I'm going to open up another terminal with this plus, and I'm going to do some Ionic CLI commands. So if I do a PWD, you'll see I'm still in it. If I do an LS, you'll see I'm still in it. Now I'm going to create this application just like we would Angular, just like you're doing for the MVC challenge. So I'm going to take the To-Do app and I'm going to put it in this Ionic app. And if you remember last class, I told you some students were having problems with Ionic. I recommended them to create a new Ionic app just like I did here, and then put your Angular code into it, which is what we're going to do today. However, some students got it working with Ionic init, and they said they had no problems at all. So it just depends whether you have problems or not. But that's what we're going to do today. We create an Ionic app, and we're going to put our Angular application into it. So first things first, you'll want to know some CLI commands. So one of them was Ionic serve. That's important. The other one was Ionic start. Remember the 3 Angular commands? It was ng new, what was it? Ng serve and ng init. Was those the 3? Or no, sorry, ng generate, ng serve, and ng new. Those were the 3. So the 3 Ionics are ng start, ng generate, and ng serve. Okay, so it's Ionic start, Ionic generate, and Ionic serve. So if I do Ionic generate and hit enter, what I like about here is it actually gives you a little bit of like a UI, so to speak, in the command line. I could say Ionic generate page, but I really like just saying Ionic generate and seeing what options I have. So I can generate a page, I can generate a component, a service, a modal or module, a directive, a guard, an interface, an enum. A lot of times for Ionic, everything's going to be a page. So if I have a login page going to the home page, I'll generate it like this. But let's say in my login page, I have different components. Or let's say in my home page, I have a navbar component, I have a advertising component. In the middle, I show all my posts. Maybe that's a component, my post component. So a page can also have subcomponents. So first you start out with the page, and then you can have subcomponents. So in Ionic, they have one more. You'll remember in Angular, everything was a component. In Ionic, they have one more higher level, which is a page. So that's what we're going to use here. And that's why on MVC, I called it a page. I said component, parentheses, page. And here I'm going to put it in a pages directory. I'm going to let the CLI do it. And we're going to call this our to-do page. Okay, we're going to call it our to-do page. So I'll do pages / to-do. What I like about this is look at everything it updated. First, it updated the routing module for us. Angular didn't do this. Okay, Angular didn't do this. So if I open it up, or correct me if I'm wrong, I don't remember Angular doing this. If I open this up, it added the to-do route for me. You'll see it modified the module type script. So it added the import. I believe Angular did do this. It added the import for my to-do page. It also added a CSS, HTML, TypeScript. And one thing, let's see, sorry, this is creating it. This is updating it. One thing that you're going to have to get used to with Ionic, at least the new version, they didn't used to do this, is if you open up pages, you'll see a main routing config, which is the one we're used to using, app routing.module, TypeScript. But you'll see for each page, they also have a sub-routing file. You'll see they have a sub-routing file. Now, the purpose of this is, like I said, you can have a page, and let's say on your page, you also have a nav bar. And on your nav bar, you want to route to different parts of the page. So each page can be its own single page application, as well as the entire application itself. So it's just adding one more layer. So on my, let's say on my home page, I can route to different sub pages. And on my login page, maybe the create user page is a sub page or a sub component. Okay, so that's why they added one more routing file. So you can have, each page can have its own components. Okay, and each app can have individual pages. So it's adding one more layer of routing. So what I'm going to do now is I have the same things, except you'll notice each page has its routing, its own module, and then HTML, CSS, and TypeScript. Now notice with Angular or with Ionic, you can't specify what CSS you want to use. Remember in Angular, it said you could use CSS, it said you could use SCSS, or you could even use Sass. With Ionic, it defaults to SCSS. Now, the reason I think is because with SCSS, you could do CSS or Sass, which is pretty nice. So I think defaulting to SCSS is fine by me. So if I come back to our Canvas page, we have a little bit of code, so we don't have to rewrite everything. So if you go to lecture 19, I'm going to download this front end. So I'm going to just copy it. This is our front end from the to-do challenge. You'll see it's using Reactive Forms. Okay, you'll see it's using Reactive Forms. So I'm going to copy this front end code. And this is just our Angular app. We're not even implementing Ionic yet. You'll see everything in Ionic has the Ion keyword in front of it. So I have an Ionic header, an Ionic toolbar, an Ionic title, and Ionic content. So if you remember here, if I paste this code, we had what was called a class container because we were using Bootstrap. Instead of having class container, now they have Ionic content, which is something similar. I'm going to get rid of these spaces just so it looks a little bit nicer. And then we're going to get this code to work first with just using Angular code, and then we'll change it to Ionic Components. So let's put this code in here first. You'll see I have a form group. If I save this and go back to terminal 1, you'll see it compiles successfully, but if I go to load it, it's not going to compile because I don't have any of the backend code. So it's still running. If I go to /to-do, you'll see it kind of hop back. If I do an inspect on the console, you'll see I have a lot of errors. Control container not found. So we still need to add the backend code. So first add the front end code. Come back over here to lecture 19 and let's grab the backend code. So you'll see I have my form group. I have my to-do array. I have the constructor. I have add to-do, delete item, and to-do submit. So copy all of this code. And you're going to paste it in the to-do page TypeScript. So this is like your controller. Okay, this is your controller. You'll see it has a constructor already. I'm going to copy over this constructor and do a paste because I'm going to put my new constructor in it. You'll see there's a lot of spaces there. I'm not sure why Canvas does that, but go ahead and clean up the code a little bit so it's easier to read. Okay, get rid of the spaces. I was hoping my prettier text formatter would do this for me, but it does allow for one space. If I do a bunch of spaces and hit save, oh, let's see, maybe my prettier isn't working at all. It's not working. Usually if you do a bunch of spaces, it'll get rid of them. That's all right. Let's get rid of them real quick. Looks like we're having a lot of technical difficulties this week. Okay, so you'll see ng on init is down below. That's usually not down below, to be honest. Usually it's up here at the top. Usually you'll have your constructor and then your ng on init. If you move it up or not, it really doesn't matter. That's just common practice to have the constructor and then ng on init. So I put it up there at the top. It's usually not down there at the bottom. So I clean the code up, move ng on init up, but you'll see I still have some errors. One, it doesn't know what form group is and form builder. It also doesn't know what to do is, the type to do. So if I come back over here to the Canvas page, you'll see I have the import for you. You can copy it. Okay, I have the import for you. You can copy it. Put it up here at the top. That gets rid of quite a few errors as well. But I also need to fix this to-do type. But we haven't generated it yet. We need to generate it. Okay, and you'll see in the compiled version, it still doesn't know the type. Remember, this is where TypeScript shines. It's nice to have the type because if you ever pass data over in the code without following that type, you're going to get a compile error. Now, what's nice about getting a compile error is you're going to catch the code before you even, you're going to catch this bug in the code before you even release it. If you have to wait till you get a runtime error, that means your website crashed and the user has to report that to you. But if you can catch it at compile time, which is what we're doing, well, then your code's going to be more solid. Okay, added the import. I need to add the interface, so I'm going to go back to terminal number 2, and I'm going to do not ng generate. I'm going to do an Ionic generate. And again, I like to pop up this little UI so I can pick which one I want. If I want to do a type, that's in an interface. Okay, that's in an interface. You'll see I'm going to create a service here in a little bit, just like for your challenge. You need interfaces for your challenge as well. I usually like to put them in a directory, just like my pages. So you can either do interfaces / some developers like to use types and then / for their types. I'm just going to put them in a folder called interfaces / and some people will put it in their old folder like to do / to do. But for this one, I'm just going to put interfaces / to do. For your challenge, I actually recommend you put them in a directory. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to say interfaces. This is going to be my to-dos interfaces, and the interface name is going to be to-do. So it's going to put it in a folder. It's going to put it in an interface folder, and then I have my to-do folder, and then the interface is going to be called to-do. Let's try this. So you see I have interfaces. Inside there I have a folder, and inside there I have to-do. If I created another one, so let's say you had one for cities, you can have interface / cities / city. So I could have put a to-dos with an S here. And then I could do interfaces / businesses / business.typescript. If you didn't put them in a directory, that's okay. If you have them all in the interfaces directory, that's okay. But you should at least have this outer directory, interfaces or types. You shouldn't just have them all in your app directory and just have a bunch of random files. You at least have to have this outer directory. So now I have my interface. Let's go ahead and specify the type. I actually have that on Canvas as well. So if you come back here, you can copy it. And notice when you copy it, look what I did here. I recommend you do this for the challenge. If you did not, it's okay. Like if you put the ID in the to-do here, you said ID, which is a string, that's okay, but it's a better idea to do it this way, especially when we get into Firebase. For example, if you remember like in MongoDB, you can create, let's say I create to-do and done. The ID in MongoDB will be generated for you automatically. Same with Firebase, and same with your application. So a regular to-do, let's say it's whatever the user wants to do, and then whether it's completed or not. So that's whatever our regular data set is. But for MongoDB, for Firebase, and for your application, you may need an additional ID. When you save the data into Firebase or MongoDB, you don't specify the ID there. It's created automatically. So what you do is by doing the keyword extends, just like a regular interface in Java or object-oriented programming, everything in to-do will be copied and pasted into to-do ID. So to-do ID will have to-do, done, and ID, whereas to-do will just have to-do and done. Now, why did I do this? When I push the data into Firebase, MongoDB, or your database, you're just going to push these two items into it, and the ID will be generated automatically. But whenever you pull the data from MongoDB, Firebase, or your database, you'll also need the associated ID. So when I'm pushing data in, I'll use this interface. When I'm pulling data out, I'll use this interface. And that's why the extends keyword is very useful here. Now, if you put it in here like this, you're not going to get points deducted. But for Firebase, which we're going to be implementing here in a little bit, you have to implement it this way. So that's why I want to introduce it here now. Whenever I'm inserting data, you use this one. Whenever I'm retrieving data, I'll use this one, because Firebase will generate that ID for us automatically, or MongoDB, or your service. Your service is also generating this ID for the MVC challenge. So this is a good way to set it up. Coming back to the controller, now we need to add that import. So I'll do add an import from, we can start with our source, go into app, go into interfaces, go into my to-do directory, and get the to-do TypeScript. Once I have that, I can specify a T here and import to-do. In this case, we're not generating an ID, although if we have enough time, I can show you how to do that. If I need the ID, I'd import to-do ID. If I don't, I would just use the to-do. In this case, we're not generating an ID yet. Once I add the import, you'll see I have no errors here. Okay, I have no errors here. Now this page should run. Let's see what happens. So if I come back over here to terminal 1, it compiles successfully. If I come back over here to the web page, do a refresh, and go over to do, okay, you'll see it. Whenever it kind of goes to the page and bounces back, usually that's a compile error or runtime error. So you'll see here, it doesn't know what form builder is or any of the other components. So it just doesn't know what form builder is. Whenever you get these errors, you can go ahead and search them. You can go ahead and search them. I already know what the error is, but let's go ahead and search so you can get used to searching these errors. You'll either find an error in the console here, in the terminal, when you run and compile a file, or you may find a runtime error. So this is a compile error. In the terminal here, this is a compile error. So there's no compile errors. It compiled successfully. In the browser, when I go to the page and find an error here, this is a runtime error. This is a runtime error. So if I search this runtime error, Stack Overflow is not usually the best, but sometimes it is. You'll see you either need the forms module. Remember when we first did our first form in Angular? This is called template-driven forms, and this is called reactive forms. We're not going to use template-driven forms anymore. We're mainly going to focus on reactive forms unless we're getting a quick page up. Template-driven forms are good if you want to get a quick page up. But for MVC challenge, you cannot. So you have to use the reactive form module. So we need to add that import. Now, normally, we put it over here in app module TypeScript. So if I try that here, if I import from, okay, it's going to be at Angular /forms. And if I want to import the reactive forms here, and let's say I put it in here, this is where you would normally do it in a regular Angular app. Let's say I had the import here, compiled successfully. This is in app module TypeScript. It's not going to work, so you can just watch me for a second. If I refresh, then go over to do, I still get this error. Okay, I still get some error. It just says control container. You can probably search this error here. I don't know what will come up, but this is a really generic error. And the problem is each page has its own module. So you're not going to import it in the, you can call this like a superclass. You're not going to import it in the superclass module. You're going to import it here in the pages module. So I can actually take this out. It's not going to work. If you get that random error like that, most likely it is that problem. I'm going to copy this import here and put it in my to-do module TypeScript. This is where it should go. Okay, so I'm in my to-do module TypeScript. I add reactive forms, and then make sure you add that as an import. Okay, once you add it here, which is the correct place, if I come back to the web page, website, go back to to-do, now you'll see it doesn't do that little flash thing. Did you see that little flash and it goes back to 8001 and gets rid of your /? That's because the page had a runtime error. Now, it does not have a runtime error. It doesn't look good, but at least it's running. Okay, at least it's running. So you got to put your imports here in your pages module, not in the super module here. Now I'm curious though what that error would have given us. So if I'm just curious if we search it real quick, leave it in here. I'm just going to do this real quick while you guys are setting that up to see what that error would have said on Google, if we could have found it or not. So if I leave it here, come back to the page, do a refresh, go back to to-do. Okay, we get the red wall of death. Search the red wall. Anything useful? It says in app module, I added reactive forms in my import section. Remember to import it at the top as this. In your app component TypeScript, you have to define form group. So it kind of tells you, it's kind of telling you that, hey, you know, I tried to put it in here, but it's not really working. Okay, and if you wanted to really find it, you would have searched Ionic here at the beginning. You would have searched Ionic, and then you probably would have found a little bit more help. So whenever you search an error, make sure you type Ionic now. But anyway, we know what it is. So I'm going to leave that comment in there so you know what not to do when I post this up on GitHub. Okay, but you'll want to have this ready to go. You can even probably use some of this on your exploration as well. So this is important code to have. Once you have the import here, you'll see it's working. Okay, you'll see it's working, but this is not Ionic. Okay, this is just regular HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And I'm trying to use Bootstrap here, but Bootstrap's not being used because you're not going to use Ionic in Bootstrap. Bootstrap is a CSS library. Ionic has its own CSS library. So that's where Ionic Components come in. Okay, Ionic Components come in. So if I search Ionic Components, this is going to be your best friend. It tells you everything you could do. It shows you the cards like I showed you several times. You have the Ionic date picker that you can use. And I like it because it has examples. Remember, this is for mobile devices. So a mobile device's date picker pops up. If you want it to work on desktop, there's alternatives to this as well. Remember, I said you can use the same code for desktop, iOS, Android. I actually found out today that you can also make what's called an Electron application, which is a desktop app, a real desktop app like having an icon down here on your desktop, and Windows phones. So Ionic pretty much can work on every system, which makes it really nice to use. I can use my same website code to make a desktop web application, which is like going to a URL in the browser, then an iOS app, an Android app, an Windows or Mac app, and a Windows Phone app. So every platform that you can think of, it works on. Ionic works on, which is really awesome. So I don't know these by default. You know, I actually have to come and look at the components page as well. You'll see it has some kind of Bootstrap kind of mixed with material is how I see it. So I don't know these. I usually have to look them up. But what we're going to do is we're going to replace them here in the HTML file. So come back to your HTML file, and let's fix this up a little bit. So first of all, like I said, we don't need this container. This was a Bootstrap container. We don't need that anymore. So let's get rid of the container. Now form is still required, so we'll leave the form here, but you'll see this is class form group. Okay, they don't have form group as a class. Everything will be an Ionic HTML element. Just like if you were using Angular material, they don't have a Ionic form, but they have Ionic form elements. Okay, so if I come back over here, you'll see I specified a title here, which was a bootstrap title. Instead, we're going to use the Ionic title. So I'm going to take this text and put it up here in the Ionic title. I'm going to get rid of these divs. Look how short my code is becoming because I'm going to use Ionic components. You'll see this was bootstrap as well. Now I'm coming to input. They actually have an Ion input element. So it's called Ion input. Then you specify the type. Let's say type is text. And then we can just copy the rest. Form control name, placeholder. This is all good. And then you'll see you close the Ionic input here. So what this is Ionic built their own components. So in node modules, when I import Ionic, which is what we're doing, you can imagine the Ionic team built an Ionic input component and they define what the CSS is. So I could use it directly here, just like a component that we would build. And then you'll see here, I had a span, which was a clickable span. And then I had a material icon. Instead, we're going to use an Ionic icon. Okay, you'll see how I kind of encapsulated that into a span. So what I can do is I have two options. I can either make a button or I can make an Ionic icon. So let's try the Ionic icon. So I'll say Ionic -icon. You need to specify the name so it tells you what icon to use. We're going to use the add icon, which is a little plus symbol. And then we're going to make this clickable. You'll see I didn't make the icon clickable. I made the span clickable. So if I want to do this, I'm actually going to encapsulate everything into what's called an Ionic item. It's kind of like putting it into a container. You can think of it like a container. Okay, so I have my Ionic icon add. And that's pretty much it for the Ionic icon. Okay, we're not going to do too much to it. But on this Ion item, okay, this Ion item, we're going to add the click function here. Let's see. Actually, I don't know if we want to do that. Let's try to add it on the icon first, and let's see what happens. So let's add this click function here. So I'm going to take the same click function and disabled, and I'm going to put it on the Ionic icon. I'm thinking if you click this entire group, then it's going to try to submit. We may not want that. So let's try it here just on the icon at first. We may move that later. So I can get rid of this. And then you'll see here I want to display the data in a span with the to-dos length, and I have an unordered list. Okay, if I want to do something like a span or a div, you always put them in Ion item. So I'll say Ion item. I have a new item, which is going to be the same as this span. So I can copy this over. Okay, and put it in the Ionic icon, or sorry, the Ionic item. I can get rid of this. We're not going to use any of our own CSS anymore. We're going to use all Ionic stuff. And then here you see I have an unordered list, which is UL. I'm not going to use that anymore. I'm going to use an Ionic list. I'm going to use an Ionic list, and you'll see I had an NG4 on it. So I'm going to put my NG4 on it. I'm just going to copy and paste so I don't have to type this all over again. So I'm going through and I'm converting everything. Now, like I said, I don't know these from scratch, so I'd have to go look them up myself as well. So I'd come back to the components page and I'd search on Google how to make an Ionic list, unordered list. And then you'd see this would pop up. How to make an Ionic div or Ionic span. You'll see Ionic item pops up. So you need to search what the conversion is. Okay, so I don't need any of these bootstrap elements anymore. I'm already did my list item. You'll see I print out the text. Okay, so in my Ionic list, I'm going to make an Ionic item. Pretty much everything in Ionic is an item. And then that's going to hold my to-do text. So I'm going to copy this, put it up here. And it's going to also hold my Ionic icon. So you'll see I'm using a material icon here that's a delete icon. Well, Ionic has that already. So I'll put an Ionic icon instead of material. And the name here will be close. And again, I don't know the icons by heart either. I'd have to search that. And then I'll put a click function on it. Okay, I'll put a click function on it. Now, Ionic 5 has new icons. So they have a bunch of icons. It's really nice. You'll see I don't need this list item anymore. I don't need the unordered list. And I don't need the div. So you really won't see any regular HTML elements. And look how short this is now. I don't need to use Bootstrap anymore with regular HTML elements. I'm using all Ionic elements. And this is the finalized code. So now I have a form, Ionic items and inputs and icons, or everything's Ionic dash something. Okay, and that's how your challenge should go for the Ionic challenge. You should not use your own CSS, and you should not use regular HTML elements. Now, the only reason I'm using a form is because Ionic doesn't have their own form, but they do have form elements, which is what I'm using here. So if I save it, okay, if I save it, let's see what it looks like. I'll come back to the code. Let's just see if it worked. Now I'm going to select to do. Okay, it's in dark mode, but you'll see it does look better. I have my title up here. I have add to do. You'll see it's red because it's disabled. If I do text or test, it turns green. Remember, this is supposed to be on a mobile device, so if I shrink it down, this is what it should look like. Yeah, this is what it should look like. You'll see my little plus symbol if I add it. We're having some issues here. That's okay, but at least you see my Ionic icon for close. Okay, so you see the UI does look much better than before because this is now Ionic, which is made for mobile devices. I can use it on desktop. Okay, I can use it on desktop, but it's made for mobile devices. So let's see if I come back. Someone says I got an error. Can't bind disabled since it isn't a known property of Ionic Icon. What we could do, and maybe you can determine which one looks better. Maybe instead of having an icon here, maybe what I could do is put a Ionic button. Maybe Ionic button can be disabled. So let's say I do an Ionic button. And you can determine which one looks better. I copy the same contents over. Let's see, disabled. And we're going to call this our add button. And let's see if this looks any better. So I'm going to compile this. Here it is. So here's the button. That's a small button. I don't really like that, but I do like when I do expand equal to full. Now, I don't know these properties. I'd have to look this up, which I did look up. And now you'll see I have a button here. If I do, you'll see it's red. If I do test, it turns green. Hit add. You'll see it adds and the button is now enabled. So whichever one you think looks better. If I can't put disabled on an Ionic icon, maybe we could disable the, maybe we can disable this Ionic item. I don't know. Let's see what this looks like. It's disabled, so now I can't even click into it. So that's not a good idea. I guess what you could do is you could have like an if statement. If you click and there's nothing here, then print out an error message. They actually may have some disabled for icons. Maybe they have a different keyword. I kind of like the look of this plus button, but maybe this large button down here is better. Let's see. Can you put it in a button? That's a good idea. Let's try that. Let me put this in a button. Okay, let's try this. Let's put it in a button. Oops. And then in my button, instead of add, I'll put this Ionic Icon inside the button. Let's try that. And then on this Ionic Icon, I don't need the clicks anymore. It just looked like this. So I have a button. In the button's the add. Let's take a look at this. Okay, it kind of encapsulates it into a blue button, but at least it is working. Okay, I don't know if you could disable this button somehow, but at least we're not getting that warning there. I mean, that's UI design. Whatever you think looks best. You can see all these different options here. Whatever you think looks best will work. The main thing is that you want to use Ionic components. You don't want to use Bootstrap. You don't want to use material here. You don't want to use regular HTML and CSS. Everything is transformed into Ionic components. That's the most important thing here. Okay, so you're seeing this transformation, right? We didn't start with an Angular app and put Ionic into it. We developed an Ionic app and copied and pasted our code, our Angular code into it, because Ionic and Angular work hand in hand. Ionic's built on top of Angular. Okay, so I can put my Angular code into it. That's what we did. But now we want to implement it with proper MVC. We're not doing that right now. We need to then make a services page, just like your challenge. So I'm going to come back over here to terminal number 2, and I'm going to do Ionic Generate. So everything you do in Angular, you're going to do in Ionic. The only difference is, for example, here they have pages instead of just components. And in addition, they have a routing file in each page. But interfaces, services, all that's going to be the same. So I'm going to do an Ionic Generate. Let's get our MVC up. I'm going to do Ionic Generate. And I'm going to look for service. So I scroll down, I have page components service. I'm going to generate a service. I'm going to put this as my services directory. And I could even create a directory for each service. Even though there's only 2 files, I could create a directory for each service. So I could say, this is going to be my data service. And then I can actually call the service called data. Or maybe this is my to-do data service. And I think you probably want to do uppercase here so it puts a dash. And then I'm going to call this my to-do data service. Okay, that's how I would probably do it. It looks kind of funny because we only have one. But on the challenge, this is how I'd probably do it. So I'd have a services for my cities. I'd say city model. And then I'd just call it city.service. And then I'd have services or models. And I'd call it my business model. And I'd call it business.service. That's how I do it for the challenge. For this, I'm just going to put data service. So it's services. And I'm going to make one model for all of the data because I only have one page anyway. But if you had 3, I'd probably put these 2 files into a directory itself just to make it a little bit cleaner. So you see I have my data service here. And right now, everything's in the controller. Everything's in this, basically our TypeScript folder, our TypeScript file. So what I want to do is I want to take anything that deals with data and anything that manipulates the data and put that into the service file. That's what I want to do. So you just go line by line. So to-do form, that's a form element, that's a view element, that's not going to go. But the to-do array will go. So I'm going to copy it. I'm going to put this over here in my data service. Okay, I'm going to be switching back and forth, so I don't know the best way for you to follow along. But we're going through anything that has to do with data or manipulating the data, we're going to put into the service file. So add to-do, delete item, and to-do submit, they're all going to go in the service file. Okay, they're all going to go in the service file. So after the constructor, go ahead and put these 3 methods here. Okay, you're going to put these three methods here. So I have add to do, delete, and to do submit. Now I really don't need to do submit anymore because that was for submitting the form. Pretty much all I'm going to do is add to do and delete to do. Okay, so I really don't need this to do submit anymore. I'm actually going to delete this. That was for submitting a form. That was our event listener. So we don't need that anymore. And you'll see I have an error here, so I need to import that interface. So let me import that to do interface. Okay, it's going to be in our app. It's going to be in our interfaces. And it's going to be our to do directory and the to do TypeScript file. Okay, so I added that import up at the top. Okay, so we're doing model view controller here with our to do app in Ionic. Okay, in Ionic, I'm calling this our data service. This is really our model. This service file is our model. This page TypeScript is our controller. So now once I have this model defined, I can then import it in the controller. Okay, so this is defined. It looks like it's working. I'm going to go back over to the controller. I'm going to import it. Okay, and this is what you must do for the challenge. I'm going to import it. Go ahead and import that service file. It's going to be in our services, and it's going to be our data service file. Okay, and if you just type a capital D, you'll see it imports it there for you. It's called our data service. Okay, once you have the import, I can put that over there in the constructor. So in the constructor, I need to inject the data service. So I'll do private. Usually variables will be private. Sometimes they have to be public. I'm going to call this my data service, or I can even call it my model. That may be more clear. This is my model, and it's of type data service. Okay, this is my model. Now for yours, you'll want to define the model. So you would say, this is my city model. This is my business model. This is my review model. Okay, so you have a bunch of different models here. This was just one model. And anything that has to deal with data will now go through the model. So I'm going to get rid of all this code here. I don't need this code anymore. Okay, I may need this if-else statement. That's an alert. The model should not display an alert. The controller should display alerts. So if you're displaying alerts or anything on the view, it should be done in the controller. So we may need that if statement still here. But now once I have the model, let's see, it's up there at the top. I did an import, and then I put it in the constructor. That's how you inject it. And now I'll just say this dot model, and I'm going to call the add to do method. And then you see I'm passing over the value from the form when really we have the form here. So I don't really need to pass over anything. I have the form in the back end. And if I put the regular code back, let me put this back. You don't need to do it. You'll see I actually created an object here. I'm creating an object, and then I'm essentially passing that object to the array. Well, we're using reactive forms here, so we don't really need to create the object again because we've already created it here. And that's what's nice about using reactive forms. With using reactive forms, I have this object, I can pass it around. So instead of creating this object again, why not use the object we already created? You'll see I pass the value and create a to-do object again when I've already done it up here. You'll see done is false. I already specified done is false. And the to-do value is whatever they typed. Well, that's what happens here as well. So there's no reason to create your own object again. So what I'll simply do is I'll call the model, and I'll call add to do, and then I'll pass over the form. So I'll say this to do form, and I'll say dot value. That's going to grab the key value pairs. And I don't even need to pass over whatever they typed anymore. Okay, I don't even need to pass that over. Now look how short the controller is getting. Same with delete. Okay, with delete, I don't need this anymore. I'll call my model, and I'll call the delete item. Okay, and I can pass over whatever I want to delete. Okay, because I do need to pass this over on the delete item because I need to know which one they selected. Whatever they selected is the one I'll delete. Okay, so I'll still need that. And then whenever they do a submit, you'll see I push over something to the array. I'm not going to do that anymore. And actually, I may not even need this to do submit anymore. I may be able to just use the add to do method. So actually, I'm just going to remove this. I don't need two of them. Okay, I don't need two of them. Look how short the controller just got. Okay, look how short the controller just got. And this is the whole point of the controller. The controller contains the event listeners from the view. So whenever you click on a button, it calls this method or this function. And then the model has the data and the methods that manipulate the data. And whenever the model updates the data, it needs to return it to the controller so then the controller can update the view. So let's see this run. Before we need to go to the HTML file and fix it up. So if I come back over here to the HTML file, you'll see I still have delete item, which is good. But now add to do, we don't need a parameter. And to do submit is now gone. We'll just call the add to do method here. Now you still need an ng submit. That way the user can type enter when they're on a desktop. When they're on a mobile device, they'll still need to click the button or click the icon. Okay, so I still recommend having both. This is so you can type enter or hit enter key, and this is so you can hit the button. But they'll now both call add to do. Save it. Okay, see if it runs. So you'll see I still have the app here. If I do test, hit enter, I don't see anything. Okay, I don't see anything. The question is whether it's being added or not. So I can come over here to my data service file, and you'll see I push it over. Let's do a console.log, and let's print out this to-do array. Let's see if it's actually added, and let's see if it's connected or not. Okay, so I'll come back over, type in test, hit enter. I don't see anything on the display, but I do see it here in the array. So if I do test2, click add, you'll see I have two elements. Okay, you'll see them here. I can open them up. So you'll see test and test2. So I do have two elements there. they're just not being displayed on the UI. So that goes back to this. If I search Apple MVC, the one diagram that I'm using on the challenge, okay, you'll see this here. So when I click on the add button, it goes to the controller, says controller, hey, add this to do element. Controller then tells the model, okay, add it to the array. But what we're not doing is the model should return the value or return the array so then the controller can update the view. These two arrows here are the most commonly missed arrows every time I teach model view controller. They always click the button, controller updates the model, but they always forget had to have the model return the data or return some Boolean value, return information, any information, and then the controller then updates the view. These are the two most common arrows missed. So here in this add to do, in the model, make sure you return this to do array. Now there's a few ways to do it. I can return the whole array, or I could even make this array observable. So whenever this updates, it's kind of like in 3330 when we did the fire property change. It has an event listener, or actually it was called a property change listener. So whenever the array changes, it activates over there in the controller instead of having to return the array manually yourself. I've seen students do that. That's probably a better way to implement it. This is just a quick way to easy to understand MVC. The proper programming techniques would to make this array observable or asynchronous. So whenever it updates, It lets the controller know automatically without having to return this value. And then the controller could subscribe to it. The controller can subscribe to that array. So then I wouldn't even need this array over here in the controller because I'd be subscribed to the models array. But that's okay. I just want to show you a quick example. So I'll say this to-do array equals the model. And then same with deleting. I'll say this to-do array equals whatever the model returns. So you got to have that return value. You'll see the delete item is not returning anything. So we need to add that over there in the model. Make sure your delete item also returns the array once it's finished. Okay, so if I come over here to my data service, I added these return values, so it updates this. This is kind of like a temporary variable to update the view. In the challenge, I said this is the only variable that you can have that deals with the data. If you have more, or if any of your methods actually manipulate the data, you'll get points deducted. They should reference the model, and the model should manipulate the data and then return the result, which is what we're doing here. So if you have this, it's okay. If you have more, you'll get points deducted. And then, like I said, the better way would be to have the array in the service or the model observable and have a subscription. So you subscribe the controller to that array. When it updates automatically. Okay, and here in the delete item, I'm also going to return this to-do array. Now when I run it, refresh, okay, type in test, hit add. You'll see it updates the display. I'm still having some issues here. We can find out what's happening there. Do a test 2, hit add. You'll see it does update this display, but not the values there. And I can delete and delete. Let's see. Let's fix up this add. So again, we don't need to pass and create a new object since we're passing over the object. So I'm going to delete that. And then this value, this value is going to be of type to do. Remember to always use your types. And I'm not going to say whether the value is equal to null or empty string. I'll just say as long as the to do object does not equal null. And then instead of having to create that data object again, since I'm using reactive forms, I can actually just push this value in. And technically, it's not a value anymore. This is actually our to-do object is what it is. So I'm going to switch that up too to make the code a little bit easier to read. It's actually a to-do object, and I don't have to create it again. I created it in the reactive forms. So make sure you're doing that in your challenge. And now you'll see the model, we're in the model here, is doing an alert. This is not good. Okay, alerts should be in the controller. So what you can do is you can say if it's not null, and as long as you're able to add it, go ahead and return the array. Otherwise, you can return something else. Maybe return false. Something like that. Or you can return -1, just something, some signal. And then if you detect false in the controller, you'll do the alert. You don't want to do an alert here in the model. That'll get points deducted on your challenge. Let me see if this works real quick. Do a refresh, add in test, hit add. Okay, I'm still not getting the actual value. It may be on the home page. Let me see what's going on over here. But this is correct. This is correct now, adding it to the array. Let me go back over to the HTML. Let's see what we did here. We did myTodo.text. So that's not going to be it, because in the controller here we call it to do. So if you go back over to the HTML, make sure this is myTodo.todo, and then it should work. So if I do test, hit add, you'll see it is there now. If I do test 2, hit add, you'll see it's there now. Do a test 3, hit add, delete the second one. You'll see it does in fact delete the second one. The reason I have that done variable is I was going to have a checkbox here, an Ionic checkbox, where if you check it, it will strike through the to-do item. That's where that done is there, and then you can delete it. We haven't got there yet. In addition, I wanted to show you how to use Ionic's local storage. So whenever you push it to the array, we update the local storage on Ionic. We haven't got there yet either. Okay, so we're out of time for today, but we will add those in. Okay, so we still need to do Ionic storage, and I want to do the little checkbox, and there's a few other things as well, but you can see how I'm implementing this for the challenge. So if you wanted to use Ionic, you could. You can add it to your Angular project if you do an Ionic init, or you can create the Ionic app and put these into it like I'm doing here. Another option is using Angular material. Okay, but the main thing is to get that challenge done. By the way, before you leave, the TA is holding office hours tonight. I believe they're at 5. So right after this lecture, if you need help with the challenge, go to the TA's office hours. He's doing an additional office hour this week to help everybody out. There's no office hours on Friday, so tonight's the last night you can get help. So if you got any questions, make sure you go to the TA's office hours. If I have some time, I may stop by as well to help students. But today's the last day you can get help for that challenge. It's due on Friday. On Friday, we'll check emails the best we can. But hopefully you pretty much have it done by now. A lot of students have already submitted it. So get it done. Fix it up. If there's some stuff here that I told you to do, you want to fix it up a little bit, that's fine. Get it submitted. Get it done. We're going to post the next exploration here soon. Okay, we're going to post the next exploration soon. So I'm going to get that up probably on Friday. I'll post that too so we can get going on it. Okay, there's a lot of content here. I was trying to go quick because we missed a lot of this content last class. So we're kind of making up a little bit from last class. So if you weren't able to follow along, I apologize about that. But I'll post a video here soon. Make sure you go back over this. This is an important lecture. You'll pretty much use this lecture on the Ionic challenge. Okay, it's very important. I'm also going to show you how to take this Ionic app and put it onto an Android device, put it onto an iOS device, which is one of the coolest things about Ionic. That's the whole reason we're using Ionic, is so we can make a mobile app. Okay, that's the whole point of Ionic. Take web code and make a mobile application, which then you can put on the App Store. You can put on the Apple Store, the Google Play Store. And that's the whole point of using Ionic. Okay, we're out of time for today. Put your name and pop it on the chat so I can get you for the attendance. It's Thursday, so have a good weekend. Make sure you get that challenge done and do it right. If you need help, we're here to help. You got to ask, though. We don't know if you're having problems or not. Please ask. We're here to help. We want you to get that challenge done. Have a good weekend. Get the challenge done. I'll post the next one here soon. And then we'll see you guys next week.